Ted Lance, Mark, Dan Ehrman, we'd all like to welcome you to this session of the Open Classroom. We're going to be talking about Trump and his influence on the courts and how the courts may be a campaign issue, but also I think may also be an issue and a key factor in the impeachment debate that's developing in Washington. Can you hear me now? We're trying to work. There we go. We're trying to work on that. I'm going to ask Jean to just explain for those who are following this on live stream where you can find the live stream link, and then I'll come back. Do you want to try to explain that, Jean?
Okay, so we live stream via Facebook Live. All you have to do is go to our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Northeastern Policy School. You do not have to be a Facebook member to see the our page. And so this is the front, and you'll just scroll down, and you'll see too, when we have live videos, there's a little red box that says live next to our name, so you really can't miss it. So you can just scroll down, and then I'll show you the one from last week. Actually, this is the one that's coming up right now. So this is what it looks like. Does that make sense for everyone? Does anyone have any questions? Yes. So you can view past weeks on Facebook and on our YouTube page as well. Sure.
Great. So I just want to let people know. So for next week, we have a terrific panel that's going to be looking at questions of American identity and race and gender. Ben Bradley Jr. Was on the Boston Globe, on the Spotlight team for many years, went to Pennsylvania after 2016 and wrote a terrific book looking at these counties that had voted for Obama but that switched to Trump, and did a real in-depth investigation for his book called The Forgotten, about why those people ended up with Trump. And he'll be talking about that. Also on the panel will be Margaret Burnham, who's a professor of law at Northeastern, was a former judge here in Boston, is a real force of nature, and it's always a treat to kind of hear her talk, because she talks with incredible passion about not only the journey of African Americans and of civil rights, but also where we're going as a country, trying to stitch things together. And Meg Heckman of the Journalism School faculty, who is looking at gender issues and this campaign, both in terms of how women candidates are presenting themselves, but also how the media is covering them. Women were very heavily represented in coverage of the campaign in 2016. That's not as true now, and she's documenting some really interesting examples of how that's affecting coverage. I know for some of us it's the Jewish holiday, but it is after sunset, so those of you who can come or follow us on live stream, I think it'll be a really very interesting evening. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dan Ehrman, who will introduce the panel and then show some videos to get us started.
Thank you, Jonathan, and good evening, everyone, and thanks for coming out on a rainy night. So today we're going to talk about President Trump and the courts, his judicial legacy. A lot of people are familiar with his Supreme Court picks because they got so much media attention. But President Trump overall has had, I believe, 152 judges approved by the Senate. And we are fortunate enough to be joined by our distinguished panel. I'll start with Jennifer Braceras, who is an attorney, a graduate of Harvard Law School, like 5 justices on the Supreme Court. And Jennifer served on the Civil Rights Commission under George W. Bush, is a syndicated columnist, and is on the Board of Visitors for the Federalist Society for Law and Policy, which we will talk about today. Welcome, Jennifer. And Jeremy Paul, who is also a graduate of Harvard Law School, has taught at the University of Miami, has taught at the University of Connecticut School of Law and served as dean there. And he has also served as dean here at Northeastern, and he will be teaching constitutional law next semester, and he just remarked that he has a lot of updating to do as he prepares to teach it. because a lot has changed, not just since 2016, but maybe since the last time Jeremy taught con law. And that's part of what we'll be debating, how the Constitution changes and how it should change. So what I want to do, especially for those of you that maybe don't remember or weren't quite here during the Robert Bork nomination, is I want to start with a video that gives an overview of the Supreme Court nomination process and talks about some of the flashpoints. Many of you recall just about a year ago that the nation was quite divided over Justice Kavanaugh. Well, that was not the first time. And for the modern era, I think the Bork nomination really represented a watershed moment. So we'll go through some video clips. Then there's a graph which shows the impact that President Trump has had on the overall federal judiciary. And then we will talk to our panelists, including my colleague, Ted Landsmark. Thanks. So that's a brief overview, and that was from 2010. As you can imagine, that was before the Kavanaugh hearings. One other thing that we don't have video for, but just to provide some background, is the 60 vote requirement for cloture or the filibuster rule. So the big change that occurred is that in 2013, Senator Harry Reid, after his perception of obstruction for Obama's federal judges, lowered the threshold for all cabinet appointees and federal judges on the circuit and district courts from 60 to 51 or 50 plus the vice president. And then when President Trump took office and nominated Neil Gorsuch, they invoked what was known as the nuclear option in the Senate and made that change for Supreme Court nominations as well. So since early 2017, we are no longer in an era where you need 60 votes for a Supreme Court justice to move through. Now it's 50 or 51. So we're going to show a few clips that involve moments around the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, and then we will bring our panelists up to offer their thoughts. That was Senator Whitehouse's opening statement in the Kavanaugh hearings, but then as many of you recall, everything changed when Christine Blasey Ford publicly testified making allegations about Brett Kavanaugh's behavior in the early 80s. Okay, please join. There's a lot there. I'm sure that people in the crowd have questions as well. So first, I'm going to talk to my co-panelists a little bit about this, but we look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions as well. So, Jennifer, thoughts on what you just saw?
Can you hear me? Yeah. There's a lot to unpack there. So I'm not really sure where you want me to start, but I think the first clip you showed is important because it shows actually what Senator Whitehouse was talking about, a pattern of smearing Republican nominees to the United States Supreme Court. And interestingly, if you look at it, some of the same characters who were involved in bringing down Judge Bork were also involved in targeting Justice Thomas and Justice Kavanaugh. If you look at who the activists were, it's the same people. So there is a pattern here. And I'm happy to say that at least at this juncture, Republicans have never done to the Democratic nominees what the Democrats have done to the Republican nominees. Garland was blocked. He was not borked. Nobody ever criticized his personal morality. Nobody accused him of being a closet racist, misogynist, anything else of that nature. Nobody went through his trash to look for evidence that perhaps he was looking at pornography. Nobody did any of those things to Merrick Garland, and Merrick Garland would tell you that if he were here today. What was done to Merrick Garland was, in my view, unfair. And I've said many times that if I had been in the United States Senate, even as a Republican, I would have voted for Merrick Garland. He was qualified. Elections have consequences. And the consequence of a presidential election is that that person gets to pick nominees to the United States Supreme Court. So I think reasonable minds can differ on whether that was a good choice. I also happen to think, certainly at the time, it was an extremely risky strategy for Mitch McConnell, even from the perspective of conservatives, right? Because most people thought Hillary Clinton was going to win that election. And by holding that seat, he took a very real risk, McConnell did, that Hillary Clinton would withdraw the nomination of Merrick Garland and appoint her own person, somebody much more radical than Merrick Garland, who by all accounts is a left of center incrementalist. So I thought that strategically it was extremely risky of the majority leader to do that, and I also didn't happen to agree with it. But that said, judicial nominations, well, I will say this, while judges are above politics and life tenure protects them from the political winds, the nomination process is inherently political, and the confirmation process is inherently political. And the Republicans controlled the Senate, and therefore McConnell had every right to do that, even if it's wrong. If the Democrats control the Senate at some point during the presidency of a Republican, they, I'm sure, will and can do the exact same thing, and that is their right. When you're in the majority, you have power, and as long as you're playing by the rules, you can exercise that power even in ways that are unfair. So I do believe that elections have consequences, and when you vote for president, you are voting for the person who's potentially going to be picking the next Supreme Court justices, and when you vote for senator, you are voting for the people who are going to be confirming them. And Republican majorities or Democrat majorities in the Senate matter, regardless of which side of the aisle you're on or what your judicial philosophy is or what your view is of the type of people that should be appointed to the court. So, on one hand, all is fair in love and war, but to a point, right? So exercising your power in a way that comports with the rules and blocking a nominee, I think is fair. Making up lies about people and saying that Judge Bork wants blacks to sit at separate lunch counters, which is patently false, is not fair. It's not fair. It's a smear. It wasn't fair to him, and what they did to Thomas and Kavanaugh wasn't fair either.
I hope no one could watch any of that and not feel sad for the fact that what has happened to the the majesty of the court has been brutalized by recent times. But one of the things that struck me the most about those clips is from the Marcia Coyle thing, is that somehow or other the idea of politicized is seen as more like baseball teams than like the merits. So the opposition to Robert Bork, and I am not necessarily going to defend everything that Ted Kennedy said, was based on an effort by a newly elected Democratic senator to preserve what I would describe as the two great judicial accomplishments of the second half of the 20th century. Brown versus Board of Education, not that Bork was necessarily opposed to it, right? But his philosophy of originalism is very difficult to square with the outcome of Brown versus Board of Education. Well, he tried, but people were nervous about it. And the second thing was to protect us against a theocratic movement, which is how I would describe the effort to make abortion illegal in many, many of our states, which still goes on today. The theocratic movement.
I have to interrupt. We have rules of engagement in this class, and the thing that protects a decade of the integrity of our being able to hold an open classroom, which invites the public to join with matriculating students in dialogue, is that we respect speakers, audience to speaker and speaker to speaker, and that we let people have their say, and then we enter into open, honest, authentic, and ethical dialogue with each other. This is not a TV show on CNN or Fox where we interrupt each other when people are making their statements. And so in fairness to each other and to the integrity of a decade of this class, I'm going to ask both that folks in the audience, whether you, or class, whether you agree or disagree, let the speakers speak. And I'm going to ask the speakers not to get into argumentative dialogue while the speakers are presenting their points of view. That seems only fair to me and to the integrity of this class. Please.
So I don't know what your time limits are. I'll try to keep this as brief as I can. But the point I'm trying to make is that the left-right politicization that you see in the press tends to blur some of the more serious questions about what was actually at stake in these cases. Now, as far as what happened with Clarence Thomas and Brett Kavanaugh hearings, I don't know how you can call it. I don't know how you can call it a smear when the truth is none of us knows whether Anita Hill was telling the truth, and none of us knows whether Christine Blasey Ford was telling the truth. So at the moment after those testimony, if you ask people who watched it, a lot of people found it credible. Even the Republicans agreed to the hearing. Now, did Dianne Feinstein make a mistake in the way she handled it? That's fine. But the idea that somehow or other we're going to go from the 1986 hearings about Bork to the idea that it's the Democrats' fault for everything that has ever happened, as you see in that Marcia Coyle clip, I think that really is a mistake. And I think that the reason why I think the Sheldon Whitehouse speech was so important, even though you cut it off before he got to the point where he actually went through the cases, is that if we're going to talk about Trump and the politics of the court appointments, what the people understand is they know about abortion, and they've heard of Citizens United, but the huge number of other cases that the 73 cases that Senator Whitehouse was talking about are not cases that are necessarily available to the public to understand, but it's an extraordinary coincidence that the same judges who happen to be for the idea that abortion is not protected by the Constitution and who tend to be against affirmative action also happen to be the same judges who are opposed to class action lawsuits, who have very tough rules about standing, who make it much more easy for corporations to win summary judgment in their cases. So that you have this unholy alliance between rhetoric that's tossed out to the public to get votes from people who want white supremacy and want a religious country, and very powerful business interests. And that's what's happened to the Supreme Court. And it's and the way it's used in politics. And it's very sad. And as a constitutional law professor, I wish that we could think of something to do differently.
What we didn't see in the clips was a moment that was unprecedented, which was during the 2016 campaign when Donald Trump, who had not served in public office, was not a lawyer, although his sister sits on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit, put out a list, a list with input from the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation. I'm curious about your thoughts on that decision and the role it may have played in his 2016 election.
So let me just first say, I agree that it's a sort of a sad state of affairs that we've come to with the court. And I do think that, like a lot of other things in society, the media plays a big part in that, right? Because what's the difference between Robert Bork's nomination and nominations that occurred years before? Television, right? And so I think that interest groups are able to use the power of the media on one side or another to talk about these issues in ways that are not helpful to civic discourse, to begin with. Trump's list. I think that list won him the nomination. There were a lot of conservatives that were not happy about Donald Trump. And they were willing to hold their nose and vote for Donald Trump because of that list. And essentially, I think both sides of the aisle would agree that a president's only lasting legacy is his appointments to the federal bench, because those people serve for life. So what laws are passed or repealed or regulations are enacted or withdrawn can always be changed by the next Congress or the next president. But the judges serve for life. And so that list was really important. Now, a lot of people criticize the fact that he, quote unquote, outsourced it to the Federalist Society. I actually think that was a good thing. I'm on the Board of Visitors of the Federalist Society, so of course I think it's a good thing. But the way I try to explain it to people is this. George Bush, first George Bush and George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan were not lawyers. They didn't have an interest in the courts the same way that Barack Obama and Bill Clinton did. Those presidents understood the law, understood the courts, but more importantly, they knew the players. They'd gone to law school with them. They had worked with them. They were their friends. And they didn't need to turn to anybody else to help them vet nominees, because this was their wheelhouse. And I think that what happened, you saw, now some of you are probably too young to remember this or didn't pay attention to it. But what you saw with George W. Bush, was he appointed Harriet Miers, somebody who, in the view of most people, was utterly unqualified to serve on the Supreme Court. Now, why did he pick Harriet Miers? Because the Bushes are loyal people, because Harriet Miers was his friend, because he liked Harriet Miers, and she was a lawyer. So that's who he picked. And that didn't go too well for him, and Harriet Miers had to withdraw, and ultimately he picked Justice Alito. But the point is that not having a group of people to advise him on who the best and the brightest minds are in the legal profession hurt Bush. And so I think Trump knew his limitations. He knew that he wasn't a lawyer, that this isn't his wheelhouse. And so he consulted people who know the players. And I will add one other thing about the list. Not only do I think it got him the nomination, I think that it has potential to win him the election in 2020. Not the list per se, but the people he has appointed. Because now you have a lot of, I did not vote for Donald Trump. I'll just put that out there. But I know a lot of people who did not vote for Donald Trump, Republicans or independents, who now say, I really like the people he's appointed to the bench. I really like the people he's appointed to the Supreme Court. I'm going to vote for him, because it's a lot different than when you're just voting for two people, neither of whom are incumbents. Now you have a record. Now you see the courts. And most Republican or conservative or right-leaning lawyers are very, very pleased with who he's appointed.
I don't have a lot to say about the list. If you say that the list helped him to win the Republican nomination, I have no basis to dispute that. Certainly, given his personal history and his earlier views on social issues, if you were a conservative on social issues, you would have had reason to doubt him if he hadn't put that list out. I also think that consulting groups such as the Federalist Society for someone who is a lawyer or is not a lawyer it makes total sense. I wish that the Republicans had not issued a broadside against the American Bar Association's group that has always previously had a special role in evaluating the judicial nominees, because the idea that they're a liberal group, here at Northeastern they would not be viewed as a liberal group. And so the idea that somehow they're a partisan group, and more of Trump's judges have been rated unqualified by the ABA than those of previous people. But for Supreme Court judges, you would like to think that the president himself or herself, hopefully one day we'll have a herself, would want to look more deeply. But for all of the other people on the courts, you can't possibly expect the president to know, what each and every judge is like. The idea, though, that anybody who was what you describe as a conservative lawyer would be excited or even willing to think about voting for Trump in the 2020 election because of the judges he's picked, that strikes me as a total betrayal of the idea of being a conservative, because there's absolutely nothing about President Trump's time in office that has reflected being a conservative in terms of his attack. He calls people so-called judges. He attacked a judge because his parents were from Mexico. I mean, he's not a conservative in the sense that the Federalist Society has been in the past. And so I think that it's terrifying to think that anybody would now want to vote for him for conservative principles.
I actually agree with you in the sense that, Trump is not a typical conservative. But again, I go back to the only lasting legacy is the judiciary. And so I'm not telling you this as a normative thing. I'm telling you this as a descriptive fact that people I know in the conservative movement who were never Trumpers and did not vote for him the first time are willing to vote for him this time because they view it as playing the long game. And they know that if Trump is reelected, he's only in office for 4 years and the judges will serve for life. So that's the political calculus, agree with it or not, that some people are willing to make.
Just by way of update, it's been said that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Demand Justice, which is a group that has emerged on the left side of the aisle, plans to release their own list. And just in response to Jeremy's point about Sheldon Whitehouse, Demand Justice is concerned about corporate influence. And their litmus test is that no one on the list can have been a partner at a law firm, because they feel that, which would bar Justice Sotomayor and some other people, Justice Brennan. There's certain people that wouldn't fit, and their argument is there are plenty of good people, and they're going to come out with their own list. So in a way, that's another legacy, you could say, of President Trump's decision, which is that can become the new norm. So a lot of people have said that the Supreme Court is broken. This got, I think, more attention about a year ago when impeachment discussions actually for about a week centered around Brett Kavanaugh, but now we've moved on. And I was just curious about your views on some of the various proposals. So it's sort of a two-parter, is the Supreme Court broken? And then the second part is, what are your thoughts on some of the proposals to fix it? And just for the audience, one of them has been a fixed 18-year term, and that every president would get to nominate a justice the first and third year of each of their presidential terms. The other is one that's been floated by Pete Buttigieg based on a law review paper. It's called the Balanced Court, almost like a commission. There are 5 Republican justices, 5 Democratic justices, and then those 10 pick the remaining 5, and an expanded or packed court.
So to the first part of your question, I don't think the Supreme Court is broken, and I actually don't think if you asked any of the justices, regardless of the appointing authority, that they would say it was broken. As I think a lot of you know, Justice Scalia and Justice Ginsburg had a very close friendship. Justice Ginsburg herself has said extremely nice things about Justice Kavanaugh. And I think, it's a small collegial group, and despite the politics of what it takes to get there, I think most of them get along pretty well. And I think that they believe that the way the court works is proper. I think if you ask them, they would probably say that. With respect to court packing, it will surprise you, I'm sure not, that I'm against it. But so is Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and so is Cory Booker, and so are people on both sides of the aisle for a very good reason, that it would start a judicial arms race. And if the Democrats pack the court, the Republicans will then pack the court until ultimately, as Senator Booker has said, your grandchildren will say, Granddad, why are there 587 people on the Supreme Court? So I think it's not the right approach. I don't think term limits are the right approach either, for one very important reason, and that is life tenure really does insulate judges from the political winds. And it's really important, for example, when we talk about impeachment even, or anything, some of the things that are going on with President Trump, it's very important that the justices he appointed don't have to worry about being reappointed. And so if issues involving the president come before them, they are not going to be his quote-unquote get-out-of-jail-free card. They are going to rule based on the law and based on what they think is right. And that life tenure is so important, not just at the Supreme Court, but at every level. And if you don't have life tenure, the judges will inevitably become political actors because they'll be thinking about who the parties are before them and what their own futures hold. And so they'll be no different than the senators. They'll be posturing like the senators do on both sides of the aisle. they'll become political actors. And our system, Alexander Hamilton called it the least dangerous branch. If it's going to remain the least dangerous branch, you have to have life tenure. Now, that said, I would not be opposed to a mandatory retirement age at 80 or 85, for example, because I think people just hang on for a long time and start to let the clerks do a lot more of the work than they probably should. But I'm not for anything that would pack the court or take away life tenure.
So I guess I think the real question is not whether the court is broken, but whether the country is broken. And I would say that with respect to the Supreme Court, it's taken some really serious hits. And the place I would start with that is Bush versus Gore. So it's remarkable. I taught a freshman honors seminar a couple of years ago. I mentioned Bush versus Gore. None of the students had ever heard of it because they were so young. But we at that point had the situation in which ultimately a judicial ruling decided a presidential election, something that we never expected would happen. And what the country's reaction to that really surprised me at the time. What I would have much preferred to have seen was when President Bush took office, for him to have understood that the election basically was a tie, and that he owed it to the country to govern as if the election had been a tie. But instead, he governed as if he had a huge mandate and won all 50 states. And so, therefore, sent a message that you should do what you can get away with, as opposed to how you can get along with people. And from the point of view of the country, that left the court seeming like a political actor, much more so than it had ever seemed that way before. Now, with respect to what to do about that, I think that my colleague here, who suggests that court packing is a bad idea, is probably right. I don't think that's a good way to solve the problem. I think one of the tragedies about those hearings that we just saw is that the Merrick Garland thing to me was an outrage, and there is still simmering resentment about it among Democrats, and nobody knows what to do about that. And so the question is, how are we going to fix that problem? Because from my point of view, McConnell cheated. Obama was a duly elected president. It was a political risk, but who cares? It was a risk. It was an unjust risk. You shouldn't have been able to get away with it. But the term limits thing, I think, is much, much more complicated than has been explained so far. First of all the term limit proposals assume that when your time as a Supreme Court justice is done, you would remain a judge, you would move on to the courts of appeals, and you would continue to receive your Supreme Court salary so that you wouldn't actually be vulnerable to the winds of how are you going to vote. Secondly, I think people wouldn't hang on as long if there were term limits. I mean, if there wasn't the partisan divide that we have now, one of the reasons why people are hanging on so long is because what they're afraid of is the president's going to pick someone who they know how they're going to vote. So sure, it's true that Gorsuch and Kavanaugh are not under threat of their jobs to vote a certain way. But what presidents are doing now is they're trying to pick people who they think they can count on in order so that the nominees and justices are not as independent as they ought to be. And so the image of the court has been damaged, and we're really in a tough situation. And although I don't really think term limits in general is a great idea, I think, first of all, if you had term limits, there would be less pressure on presidents to appoint younger justices. Now they're appointing people really too young because, oh my God, I want to have a legacy. I want it to be so long. And by the way, in terms of legacy, you can destroy the climate. You can win a war. There are a lot of legacies that presidents can have besides just who they pick on this.
All right. And a lighter topic, impeachment. I was just interested in both your thoughts. Actually, on one front, impeachment and it slowing down the rest of American politics, because often we can only focus on one major thing at a time. So whether impeachment will affect President Trump's judicial legacy, number one. And then number two, sort of that interplay between President Trump and the courts and any role with the road toward impeachment. And there I'm referring to subpoenas and testimony by his aides. Just, any of your thoughts on sort of the road we're on?
Well, I sort of answered the second part already. in the sense that, if Donald Trump thinks that any of his appointees, let alone Brett Kavanaugh or Neil Gorsuch or his get out of jail free card, he's wrong. Then he doesn't understand, what the Federalist Society believes in or what conservative jurisprudence is. So he's absolutely wrong about that. And like I said, I think judges with life tenure will make their decisions based on the rule of law and not based on anything else. What was the first part? Oh, whether impeachment will distract from judicial appointments. It will distract the country. It won't distract Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell is single-minded on this, and if impeachment, if the president were to be impeached and it would go to the Senate, it would obviously occupy their time. But unless and until it goes to the Senate, Mitch McConnell is moving full steam ahead.
No, I would think if anything, he'll go faster. I see no reason to see why he would slow down. That question. I pray you're right about Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, but you have no idea. You have no idea. Neither does anybody in the room. We don't know yet what these people are going to do when they're likely to be faced with very, very significant questions that come out of impeachment. When you saw Lindsey Graham on the tape. When you watch Lindsey Graham talk about impeachment during the Clinton impeachment, and then you listen to what he says now, and you watch what he said about Trump during the election, and you listen to what he said now, he seems like a pod person who's gone through an extraordinary personality transplant. It's terrifying, right? And so given that he was willing, now you could say he's protecting his own interests in South Carolina, and he's afraid of a primary. I don't believe it. I believe that there's actually a lot more going on, which we don't understand, and I'm going to, until I see Kavanaugh or Gorsuch sign an opinion that makes Trump uncomfortable, I'm not going to believe they're going to do anything different.
I sort of start from the premise that I'm not concerned with the political result or outcome of any decision. My concern only is that judges follow the process and follow the law. And so you're right, I can't anticipate the specific facts of any case that's going to come before any judge or how they'll rule on a specific case. What I do know is that all of the justices on the Supreme Court are ethical people, and they might come out different ways on cases, but they're going to do their level best to get it right. And I think that's true of Justice Kagan. I think that's true of Justice Thomas. And frankly, I think most of them would say that about each other. So I don't think that any of them feel in any way threatened or concerned about what Donald Trump thinks of them or what Mitch McConnell thinks of them or what Senator Whitehouse thinks of them, frankly, when he sends them a brief in a Second Amendment case essentially threatening them and threatening to pack the court. I don't think that makes Elena Kagan or Clarence Thomas or any of them shake in their boots because they have life tenure. And like I said, they're just there to do a job and they're going to do their level best to do it. So that's what I'm basing it on.
I just don't think we have reason to conclude one way or the other. But I'll tell you one thing. We do have reason to have real doubts about whether Brett Kavanaugh is an ethical person, not based on whether he did or did not assault Christine Blasey Ford back when he was in high school, but on the way he handled the hearing. When he was asked, do you want an FBI investigation? He ducked it. Why did he duck it? Because he knew President Trump wanted him to duck it, right? And when he was asked to comment on her accusations, he gave a histrionic, emotional performance because the president wanted him to give a histrionic, emotional performance, which was totally contrary to judicial temperament. And my basic reaction to judicial nominations is I tend not to write letters. But when I watched that testimony, I wrote a letter opposing his confirmation, as, by the way, did many, many, many people who are neutral political types in the ABA who watched that and said that, even Justice Stevens said, that person lacks judicial temperament. So you may think he's ethical, but I think he's a climber. Now, maybe he's climbed so high, he doesn't need to be a climber anymore. We'll see what happens.
Well, you can agree or disagree with whether or not Brett Kavanaugh handled that correctly or in the way that you would have handled it. But what I saw was a person who was upset and felt attacked. And, you know, that may not have been the appropriate response. It may have been the appropriate response. I'm not going to pass judgment on that. But I don't think that impugns his ethics. I think it's very different when you're attacked. And frankly, you saw it with Justice Thomas when he called it a high-tech lynching. He was a little more reserved than Justice Kavanaugh was. He didn't have small children. It was a different circumstance, a different time, different temperaments. So people handle attacks differently. And I'm not going to look at that and say that means he's an unethical person. This is a person who, in every aspect of his professional life, has been regarded as scrupulously ethical, and not, there's no reason to believe that he's not. So I don't give that much credence.
I hear murmurs. Let's open it up to the audience. I think people want to weigh in.
And we'll have our usual rule of thumb, which is to say, we welcome questions and comments, but try to keep them concise so that everyone has a turn. And if you could group your questions geographically so that our...
So I don't think any of us really have a 100% clear idea of the truth as to the allegations against Kavanaugh. But I was wondering how you came to the conclusion that Democrats have a pattern of mirroring Republican nominees for the courts rather than a pattern of Republican nominees having sexual assault allegations against them.
Yeah, that's a fair question. I'll start with Dianne Feinstein. I think if Dianne Feinstein really believed that a sexual predator was about to become a Supreme Court justice, what she would have done is gone to Chuck Grassley. This is somebody she's served with for years. Gone to any number of her Republican colleagues and said, we have a problem. We need to go talk to the president, and we need him to withdraw this nomination. And frankly, I think that if she really believed the allegations, that would have happened. And because none of those Republicans want a sexual predator on the Supreme Court. And it really comes down to credibility, right? I mean, some people believed her, some people didn't believe her. But I don't believe that anybody who voted for Kavanaugh believed her and put him through anyway. That didn't happen. They made a credibility judgment with which you may or may not disagree. But I don't believe that Dianne Feinstein believed it. She had the allegation in the summer. She held it in her back pocket. And she used it as her trump card. And no pun intended. And another reason I believe that this was a smear and a personal attack is because you have to look at what happened when he was first nominated. When he was first nominated, special interest groups issued a press release harshly condemning the nominee without even a name on it that just said XXX. They forgot to fill in the person. So in other words, the same attacks were going to be made, whether it was Amy Coney Barrett, Brett Kavanaugh, any judge that Trump nominated was going to get the exact same press release. Then you had the hearings where Alyssa Milano was a guest, and people were dressed up in costumes from The Handmaid's Tale, and people were screaming about this and that and accusing him of not being friendly and shaking the hand of the father of a Parkland victim. I mean, so every bad thing that could have been said about this person was already being said. It was only when those things didn't work at the 11th hour that Dianne Feinstein brought this forward, because at that point she realized, well, if we can't stop him, we can at least destroy his credibility for the rest of his life. And on that she won, although she did cause 3 of her colleagues, I believe, to lose their Senate seats because of it. But she did succeed in ruining his reputation. And as he said, or was it, I don't know if it was Justice Thomas, but they're both right. Where do they go to get their names back? They will, in every article that's written about them to the day they die in their obituary, it will always be who was accused of sexual assault.
There we go. This one works? Okay. So this is one where you and I just see the world totally differently. So first of all, the idea that Dianne Feinstein could have gotten the Republicans on the Senate committee to go to the president and get him to withdraw the nomination strikes me as a fantasy. In fact, the attitude of the Republicans in the Senate was, how fast can we push this through? Because the longer it goes out there, the more things might be able to be found out. I think that the idea that the Democrats didn't believe her, I think half the Republicans believed her. The point is, the phrase sexual predator, that suggests that he still is a sexual predator. Nobody believes that, right? The question was, what happened in high school and college when he obviously had a drinking problem? And he did things, if you believe what she said, he may have done things where he doesn't remember, he's not proud of, and he wouldn't own up to, right? So did the Republicans in the Senate think they were putting a sexual predator on the court? No, I don't think they thought that. But did they all believe that he was telling the truth and she was lying? What planet are you on to think that, right? I mean, you think she made it up as a smear because she wanted to? You think Anita Hill made this stuff up? Who in their right mind would want to make this stuff up and go for the entire country and tell lies like that and have their lives ruined? I mean, it's not a plausible thing to think. Now, could she have remembered it slightly differently from how it happened so that her description was not exactly right? Sure, right? I mean, there was a long time ago. She didn't have corroborating evidence. Susan Collins' speech in which she said, look, we shouldn't vote against him because it's not proven, that was a credible speech. Right? I mean, it's perfectly legitimate to say what was not credible was there were other charges. They wouldn't investigate them. They slowed down all that stuff. But this idea that somehow or other they could have reasoned with the president, you can't reason with this president.
Here's why I think they could have, okay? Because the Republicans in the Senate and conservatives at large don't have any allegiance to Brett Kavanaugh per se. They didn't care if it was Brett Kavanaugh or Amy Coney Barrett or anyone else, as long as it was somebody who was jurisprudentially conservative. And so if you had said to me or, to any number of people that I know in Washington, we're going to withdraw Brett Kavanaugh, but we're going to give you Barrett, that would be just fine. So you presume that somehow Chuck Grassley or Lindsey Graham had some personal loyalty to Brett Kavanaugh, which doesn't exist. What they had was loyalty, to the seat. Of course, they're not going to withdraw Brett Kavanaugh and replace Brett Kavanaugh with a liberal judicial activist. No, that's not going to happen. But if there's a problem with the judicial nominee, and the answer is you're going to get an equally conservative nominee, it's just going to be a different one. Of course, they would go to the president with that if they believed there was credibility. So. You can see the facts how you want to see them, but that is how I believe the Republicans on the committee saw the facts, and that is how they would have dealt with the situation had it arisen. As for, credibility, we can get into this, but the fact is that, even her friend Leland Kaiser, who was at the party, says that she doubts the veracity of the story. Not because, as Christine Ford says, she was downstairs and nothing remarkable happened to her. She doubts the veracity of the story because she doubts very much that Christine Ford would have left her alone at a party at the age of 15, and that she would have no memory of how she not getting home. How would she have gotten home if she were stranded at the party and Christine Ford left her there? I think she'd have some memory that would be somewhat traumatic or somewhat confusing at least, and she thinks that she would have remembered that. So she doubts the story of her friend. Now, why somebody would make something up, I don't know. But people do. Not everybody who comes forward is telling the truth, even if the vast majority are. And I also don't necessarily think that Christine Ford is lying. I think Christine Ford could be mistaken. I don't know the answer to that. We'll never know. She's clearly a very traumatized, vulnerable person. I have great empathy for her. Something happened to her. I just don't think that Brett Kavanaugh did what she accused him of doing. And the reason I don't think that is because her own witnesses did not support her allegation. And frankly, it's out of character with everything I know about Brett Kavanaugh. But that's another point.
So just one very important point. This is an ahistorical thing. Of course, Chuck Grassley and Lindsey Graham would be just as happy with Amy Coney Barrett as they would have been with Brett Kavanaugh. But at the time, the election was coming, and they were worried that if they had to go through a second person, the Democrats would drag it out, the Democrats would take back the Senate, and they wouldn't be able to get their person, which of course they would not have been able to get, because after what happened with Merrick Garland, if the Democrats had taken back the Senate, there's no way they would have confirmed someone. So this idea that they would have just been oh, this is fine, we'll get rid of Kavanaugh, that just would not have happened.
I disagree, because in fact, even with the way things played out, as I said before, Democrats lost their seats in the Senate. Joe Donnelly isn't a senator today, arguably because of the Kavanaugh hearings. Heidi Heitkamp is not a senator because of the Kavanaugh hearings. And Claire McCaskill is not a senator because of the Kavanaugh hearings. So getting somebody else in there and delaying the process would not have necessarily helped the Democrats. Certainly attacking Brett Kavanaugh the way they did not help them.
I had a political question, because the Federalist Society has turned out to be one of the most effective groups in terms of changing the arc of the kind of political narrative in this country. And I'm wondering if you look back at sort of the success of the Federalist Society and the success on this kind of war for the courts, where do you think the Democrats went wrong? In other words, this is more a political question than a judicial one. But from a strategy point of view, what do the Democrats miss? And if you were advising them over the next, 10, 20 years, what do you think the Democrats can learn from what conservatives did in terms of kind of mobilizing in this area?
So I'm not sure that the Democrats did that much that's wrong. I think that one of the reasons why there was such a need for the Federalist Society is because the perspective that many of the members of the Federalist Society have about the direction of the country really differs pretty dramatically from the perspective of most people who are constitutional law professors at most major law schools. So it's not as though the liberals don't have a place for a voice. I do think that, for example, comparing the way Hillary Clinton talked about the courts in 2016 versus the way Barack Obama talked about it in 2008, he was very smart. He picked out the Lilly Ledbetter case, and he talked about that as here's something down to earth. This was for those of you who don't know the case. This was a woman who worked for Walmart, and she discovered after many years that she had been paid significantly less than men in the same job, and she brought a lawsuit, and the Supreme Court threw the lawsuit out on the grounds that it was not timely. It took too long. And Obama talked about this case all the time, and he said, when I'm elected, one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to get a statute passed to change that, which he did. It was the first thing that he signed, and it was down to earth, and people understood it. I think that from the Democrat strategy in the next election, if you're going to talk about the court, most people, when they think of the court, abortion is number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Gay marriage is number 6, and then down the line. But there are so many decisions that have so much of an impact. Oh, and then the Affordable Care Act. would be another one. But and guns. But so that would be what I would recommend as a strategy, is to pick some cases that were understandable to people that were not the familiar ones, and emphasize those.
There are no secrets. Look, I mean, I think, you know, Obama had 8 years to fill the courts with you know, his people, and he did, no differently than this president's doing. And so I don't think there's any secrets. I mean, I think the secrets are political power, right? And so it's who controls the Senate and who controls the White House. And all the Federalist Society did was, over many years, create a network and create a pipeline, and, you know, be a resource for young conservatives coming out of law school, and put on conferences and help people network and get jobs. And that's all they did. They don't take positions on things. They were essentially started off as a support group for the 5 conservatives at Yale Law School, right? Who you know, didn't have anyone to talk to. So they didn't really do anything secret. There's no secret sauce. The secret sauce is political power, and you know, you have to win that by going out there and earning it. I do think it's interesting. I read an article today, though, that there are a lot of liberal activists who are quite upset with the Democratic candidates because they feel that they're not talking about the courts enough, and that, I don't know, they said out of X number of minutes so far in Democratic debates, some small portion has been spent talking about the courts. And these you know, political people feel that the candidates are not focused enough on it. Certainly conservatives do run on issues involving the courts. So
one other thing about the Trump judges is that he's dramatically reversed the progress that the country was making on diversifying the bench. So in terms of number of men, number of whites, it's the opposite direction, and the Federalist Society has participated in that.
Okay. I have a really quick question. Back to what you said about Christine Blasey Ford being a traumatized and vulnerable woman. First of all, I just want to say I don't think that's right at all. I think she is a strong woman who stood up on a national platform, faced her accuser, and recounted the traumatizing details of her assault. Whether or not it happened, okay, but she stood up there and she did it, and she did it in front of millions of people. That is not being vulnerable. That is being strong. So
I think you can be both, actually. I mean, I agree with you.
I agree. You can be both, but I just think that was.
Don't get me wrong. I think she's strong. I think she's brave. Absolutely, she's brave. But what I saw in her testimony was also vulnerability, and you can be both. You absolutely can be both. You know, she didn't want to have to testify, and frankly, I blame Dianne Feinstein for the fact that she had to, because this could have been dealt with without putting her through that. So, yes, I do think she was brave, and she had to move out of her house after, and she's still getting threats and condemnations, as is Justice Kavanaugh, unfortunately, because people are sick in our society, and the media, you know, whips everybody into a frenzy. So I do think she was brave and strong, but that doesn't mean that doesn't mean I believe everything she said. I don't disparage her as a person, and I think what happened to her in terms of her being forced to come forward and testify can be blamed 100% on Dianne Feinstein.
I'm sorry, that wasn't even really my question. But my question is, so earlier when you said, like every article that's ever going to be written about Kavanaugh, and it's going to be like, who was accused of sexual assault? And that's because of what happened. That's because of what the Democrats smeared and all that. Okay, but he made those decisions. If that's true, like I know plenty of people who have never like committed any kind of sexual assault, thus have never been accused of sexual assault. So what I'm not really like clicking in here is that, okay, so now this man is on the Supreme Court, right? He wants to repeal Roe v. Wade and restrict access to abortions. Okay, say some Brock Turner rapes a college woman, and now she can't get an abortion, but when she accuses him of rape, that's still her fault. It's a result of his actions.
There's a lot to unpack there, but first
There's
of all,
a lot to unpack in this whole thing.
right. So for your basic question, right. So if you believe, as you do, that she was telling the truth and that he did exactly what she said, then of course it's okay to attach that to his name, because if he did it, then it should be attached to his name. I agree with that. I just don't think that he did it. So that's where you and I disagree, right? And I'm not going to convince you, and you're not going to convince me. We just have to live with that, right? Credibility is a personal judgment, and some people believe her and some people believe him. I told you some of the reasons why I believe him, and you can, evaluate them for what they are. I didn't think that the evidence held up. So my point about it being attached to his name forevermore and on his gravestone, you really can't separate that from the fact that I believe in his innocence. If I didn't believe in his innocence, then it wouldn't matter to me if they, plastered it on his forehead. So you can't really separate those two things. To your other question to your other statement, I just want to respond to this about abortion and Brock Turner, and I'm not really sure where that was going, but I will say that you're incorrect to say that Brett Kavanaugh, is against Roe v. Wade or is against abortion. You don't know that. You don't know that. And in fact, the whole point that we at the Federalist Society have been trying to make for many, many years is that one's personal opinion on abortion, whether it's Sandra Day O'Connor's or Ruth Bader Ginsburg's or Brett Kavanaugh's, really shouldn't make a difference. The role of the judge is to apply the law. It is not to make up new rights. It is not to overflip precedent willy-nilly. The role of the judge is a very limited role. And what somebody's personal view is on campaign finance or abortion or any number of issues really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who they voted for. It doesn't matter what they think about these things. If they're going to be a good judge, they should be able to 100% put those things aside when they put on those robes.
I think it's interesting that the thing that's dividing people on Brett Kavanaugh is an accusation that doesn't have really any concrete evidence one way or another. So do you think it's a coincidence that something was accused of him that's so sort of ambiguous, and we're probably never going to know whether the accusations are true or not, and it really just makes it seem like it is a smear thing, because it's not like people are accusing him of theft or embezzlement or something. It's something that there isn't any tangible evidence for. So that makes it, to me, seem like it's something fabricated, or at least a little bit fabricated. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, her testimony is evidence, right? So, to be fair to his critics, that is very powerful evidence, is her testimony. But the bottom line is, it's he said, she said. And so when it's he said, she said, it always is just going to come down to who you believe and who you think has more credibility. And based on the circumstances, the fact that her witnesses and her best friend at the time now comes out and says she doubts the veracity of the story, based on all the other factors, based on how Dianne Feinstein treated the allegation, I think that the preponderance of the evidence is in his favor. Does that mean there's no possibility that it happened? No, of course, there's some possibility that it happened. But in my view, the preponderance of the evidence is in his favor. Now, you could make the argument that if there's even a piece of a doubt, that you should still vote against that person if you're in the United States Senate, right? And that's a reasonable argument to make. But I'm not in the United States Senate, so I didn't have to make that vote. But I'm telling you that I do not believe her allegations based on the totality of the circumstances.
Kind of switching gears here, what do you make of growing gender diversity in the court system? I know you mentioned that the role of a justice is simply to apply the law, but do you think that having more women being represented in the courts or in the Supreme Court has any effect on policies or on the way the law is being implemented?
I don't think it has an effect, no, because President Trump's female nominees are going to have a very different worldview and jurisprudential view than President Obama's female nominees. And so it's not necessarily a gender thing. Of course, I would love to see more women on the bench, and I'd love to see a female president too. But that doesn't mean I was going to vote for Hillary Clinton because she doesn't share my philosophy. So for me, as a voter, philosophy comes before gender. And I think that if for President Trump and for most conservatives, judicial philosophy comes before gender. So, if I were advising President Trump, not that I would be, I would certainly go out and scour the country for conservative female lawyers and try to appoint as many as possible. But philosophy would always come first.
So I think it's very important to diversify the courts. I think that that's something every president should be devoted to. I agree philosophy is very important. But I also think that both liberals and conservatives are very likely to embrace the idea that judges, as Chief Justice Roberts put it, should call balls and strikes and try to follow the law. The problem is the law is filled with ambiguities. It's just everywhere. And if you look at the performance of, as Senator Whitehouse was saying, of the Roberts Court, and even before that, the Rehnquist Court, there are no principles that have guided the majority of the court. They overturn precedent when they want to, and they respect it when they want to. They go for states' rights when they think it's important, and they overturn them. They defer to Congress when they like what Congress does, and then when they don't like what Congress does, they overturn the Voting Rights Act, and they strike down campaign finance regulations. They overturn precedent to change the rule about the Second Amendment, good or bad or indifferent. So this idea that they're just following the law, only if it were so. We all wish it could be so, but it can't be so. And so, given that it can't be so, a non-diverse bench is not likely to produce the best possible outcomes.
We have to at least try, right? And so judges have to try to follow the law and to try to limit their discretion wherever possible. I mean, that is the nature of the beast. That is the role of the judge. If they don't try, if we're just going to say, well, I'm going to vote for X, Y, and Z policy outcome, and I'm going to vote in favor of X, Y, and Z parties because we in our society we value these parties, the little guy over the corporations say, or I'm going to make sure my ruling favors this particular political constituency, then let's just rip off the robes and elect them. I mean, let's just stop the charade. At least conservatives are trying to say, we have a judicial philosophy, we're going to hew closely to that philosophy, and sometimes the results are going to achieve conservative results, and sometimes they're going to achieve liberal results. We're not here to make a policy choice. And frankly, that's really what this all comes down to, is that the left wants judges who are on record supporting their policy choices. And so to them, not having a record at all is still bad, because they believe that the role of the judge is to do justice. And conservatives believe that the role of the judge is to apply the law. And that's the fundamental disagreement, which is more of an academic disagreement, and we can have that debate about whether it's real or not, but that's the philosophic debate. I'd love to see the federal courts be 50% female. I absolutely would, provided that they were originalist, textualist judges.
So I think nothing could be further from the description. I think exactly the opposite is the case. I think that we have to try. I agree, we have to try. I think that progressive judges try, but openly acknowledge how hard it is and where it's just not, you can't follow the law. Whereas conservatives pretend that they're trying, but in fact flip back and forth at a moment's notice depending on what's going to suit their needs. So I think that we agree on the goal, which is what you call follow the law versus do justice. Both of those are caricatures. You can't really do either one. You have to always be trying as best to do both. And I think that liberals are just much more honest about that, whereas conservatives like Justice Scalia pretended like he was always following the law, unless it helped him to go the other way, and then he went the other way.
Look, I'm not an expert on Justice Scalia's jurisprudence, but the one example that always pops into mind is the flag burning case, right? I mean, Justice Scalia politically is not in favor of flag burning and has probably had zero respect for anybody who would burn the American flag, yet he voted to say that that was, a constitutional right under the First Amendment. So there are any number of examples where politically conservative justices came out with politically liberal results by applying a conservative jurisprudential philosophy. And and you look at even the breakdown of Gorsuch, you look at the votes from last term, Gorsuch and Kavanaugh were crossing and not voting together on any number of big issues. The notion that conservatives are only appointing people who are going to vote for conservative outcomes or conservative interests, it's just false.
I agree, it's false. I don't think it's true at all. I think the court has moved so far to the right that you can actually get differences among the conservatives. Someone sent me an article recently. They did a study that said that the 4 justices who were liberals voted together more often than the 5 justices who were conservatives. And I wrote back and I said, yeah, so the 4 abolitionists always voted together, whereas the 5 plantation owners sometimes disagreed about how roughly you could treat a slave. I mean, it doesn't prove anything. Yes, of course, the Justice Scalia sometimes voted for things that he didn't agree with politically, and so do all the liberals. Every single member of the court sometimes votes for things that don't go along with their political views. The question is, which philosophy is more coherent? The conservative philosophy, and you and I just completely disagree about that.
That's fine. We can disagree about the philosophy, but I have to take issue with your analogy, essentially comparing the 5 conservatives on the court to plantation owners. I mean, this is why Donald Trump won. I mean, analogies like that where, you're sort of equating anybody with a conservative jurisprudential philosophy to a slaveholder is not only absurdly wrong, but offensive. And that is why Trump won the election. It just
a metaphor.
I have a question.
Extensive metaphor, actually.
I have a question about something that you actually just said. Previously, you said that you support any nominees that are originalist, textualist type of judges. And I'd just like to point out that the original Constitution was made at a time that a black person was worth 3/5 of a white person. Moving past that, I want to return to something that you...
We can't move past that. We cannot move past that because that's an attack. That is true, but that's not what it means to be an originalist. To be an originalist doesn't mean that you want to go back to the 18th century, okay? That's what the left would like you to believe. That is not true. To be an originalist means that you are cabined by the words of the Constitution, that you are not governed by international law or changing social norms, that you are limited to the Constitution, and you start your analysis with what those words meant at the time they were enacted. Now, circumstances change. History evolves. The facts in any particular case are different than the facts even in a case that was, heard yesterday. So the facts change. The Constitution doesn't change. It doesn't grow. It's not alive. And the people who believe in a living Constitution are essentially people who believe that the Constitution should be whatever the majority of Americans think it should be, or frankly, what the majority of the faculty lounge at Yale Law School thinks it should be. That's what people who believe in a living Constitution believe in. Originalists, the notion that they... All right, there you go. The notion that originalists somehow want to go back to the antebellum, it's offensive. Okay, England doesn't have a written constitution. We have a written constitution. We believe that those words mean something.
So moving into my question, earlier you mentioned that there is a difference between judges, the liberal judges wanting to defend justice, and then the conservative judges wanting to apply the Constitution or the law. Can you just explain that a little bit more?
I think it's what I just said. I mean, the philosophy of a living constitution is that the Constitution changes with the times, and that the role of the judge is to come down on the side of what's fair and what's just, as opposed to whatever Congress wrote.
Those aren't the same thing.
Sorry?
Those aren't the same thing, what's just and what the law is or should be.
They are, hopefully they are the same thing, but they often aren't the same thing. I mean, look at Congress passes statutes all the time where they leave things out. They make mistakes. There are conflicts, right? Or they pass a statute that protects some groups and not others, right? That doesn't mean that it's the job of the court to say, oh, by the way, you forgot this group. Let's put them in. No. Congress has to amend their laws to update for the times. That's their job. So just because a certain group wasn't included, for example, in a certain civil rights statute, it's not the job of the court to say, yeah, we really got to protect those people now. Maybe we do need to protect those people now, but Congress needs to do its job.
I want to answer this too. So you and I agree about the following: what the Constitution was like in 1789, it's been changed. So you don't need any living Constitution, not living Constitution to decide that what the law was like in the antebellum period is not the law today. You don't need to resolve this. But I just can't say this enough. It goes back to the tapes. This invention of the left and the Yale Faculty Lounge and people want to change things. This is a total media creation designed to keep people from thinking. It is there is no left that wants to write the Constitution whatever they think. That's everybody who goes through the top law schools and makes it down into the court, who's a liberal, believes in the Constitution. Doesn't believe we should make it up. We just believe that following the Constitution is very hard. It's hard to figure out what it in fact means. And so, for example, when the court desegregated the schools in Brown versus Board of Education, there was also a DC rule that had segregated schools. And the court had to decide, what are we going to do about that? Because it's not a state. And the language of the Constitution didn't say the federal government can't deprive people of equal protection, it just said the states. And they had to decide, well, should we say to the DC schools, you can continue to be segregated because the actual language isn't like that. And they decided, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to treat DC the same. I'm sure you would have agreed with that outcome. I'm sure Judge Bork would have agreed with that outcome too. So the suggestion is not that people who want to follow the Constitution are antediluvian or something. The suggestion is that following the Constitution is deeply challenging, and when we want to adapt to the times, Justice Scalia, Justice Gorsuch, Alito, all of them are adapting to the times. You have to adapt to the times. The only question is how far. And the only way to have a meaningful discussion about any of these topics, take a case, whatever the case is, read the briefs, and really try to think it through. And the idea that there's a left out there, I agree with you. This is one of the reasons why Trump won the election, because the right-wing media has invented an imaginary left which wants to get into your life and change everything, and people fall for it. And it's terrifying. We're in a terrifying political state right now.
I think that's unfair, because the truth is, and I'm trying to be very objective about this, the truth is the media on both sides does that. You can't say that they don't. And as much as there's a bias and scare tactics used by right-wing media, which there is sometimes, that also occurs with left-wing media. And more importantly, it occurs on Twitter, and it occurs in social media in a very dangerous way, I think. But But that's not the point. The point is reasonable minds can differ about what judicial philosophy is best. The point is one has to have a judicial philosophy. That's the most important thing, to try to cabin your decisions. The decisions are not supposed to be based on who the parties are or what outcome it will bring. The test of a good judge is a judge whose philosophy, whose jurisprudential philosophy, whatever it is, sometimes forces him or her to vote against their political interests. That's the test of a truly good judge.
I agree with that. I also agree about Twitter and left-wing media.
Hi. Okay. I think whether we've wanted it to or not, this has turned into a partisan fueled debate. So my question is, I think there's no doubt that it's the justice's job to uphold the rule of law, right? I think the question is how the justice interprets the rule of law. That being said, the Supreme Court is supposed to be a regulatory body. It's kind of supposed to be like the unbiased gatekeeper of democracy, regardless of what else is happening within our political systems. But I think that increasingly the courts have become more biased and they've become very partisan, kind of reflecting the attitude of our nation as a whole. Do you think that the courts could ever go back to an unbiased, unpartisan body in this country?
Well, I'm not sure entirely how much different things are actually on the courts now than they were before. The Supreme Court is only one of many courts, and you'd have to do a really in-depth survey to try to figure out, are the decisions really more partisan? But I do think that one of the reasons why there's a lot of talk now about Supreme Court reform, including the idea of term limits, is precisely because the Supreme Court can't work effectively as an institution unless the country trusts it to be nonpartisan. To be nonpartisan. I think we agree about that, right? That we want the country to think of it as nonpartisan. So the challenge is what could be done. So circuses like the confirmation hearings don't help. The best thing would be if the political leaders, this is where we also agree about political power, if the political leaders of our country began to work together more closely, going back to what I said about Bush versus Gore, if people turned to each other and said, we don't agree about these things, we got to figure this out. I think if that were to happen, I think it would be pretty easy for the courts to follow. How that can happen, I don't know, and my own personal view is that the current president is making that much, much harder.
Well, that may be true, but going back to George Bush for a minute, George Bush did not make that harder. And I would argue, if you look at George Bush's first group of judicial nominees, they were racially diverse, they were politically diverse. He appointed Democrats, which was sort of unheard of. And I'm sorry? Somebody say something? Oh, George W. Bush. Yes. Junior. George W. Bush. The second one. The son. His first group of judicial nominees were a group of men and women who were ethnically diverse and politically diverse. And he did not go in there guns blazing and say, I'm going to find, the 11 most right-wing people and put them on the federal courts. He actually did the opposite. And he got no credit for it. And in fact, the Senate Democrats, we can talk about Miguel Estrada all day probably, but the Senate Democrats blocked some of those nominees the same way that, they try to block other nominees. And look, if they had the power, I suppose that was their right to do it. But the point is that, I'm just responding to what was said previously, that somehow George Bush won this very narrow election, and came in and thought he had a mandate to, stack the courts with hardcore right wingers. He didn't do that at all.
I wasn't referring in any way to George Bush's judicial nominees. I was referring to his cabinet and his policies, right? Yeah.
Hi. So I apologize. I don't mean to shift things back, but I think one of the things that a lot of people are frustrated by in terms of looking at things like the Kavanaugh hearings is it seems very separated from the way things work in the real world. Like, for example, my field is computer science. When I apply for a job as a software developer, it's not good enough that I have a portfolio of well-developed code with me when I go into a job interview. I also have to act in a calm and collected way, and even if I'm asked a question that makes me uncomfortable, I can't, just respond in an emotionally maybe unstable way and that makes the interviewer uncomfortable. I'm just not going to get the job in that circumstance. And so when we see Brett Kavanaugh in the hearing, and he's responding in a way that maybe a lot of people see as, not very collected and not very befitting of someone who's going to be making important decisions, that's alarming because that's just sort of not the chance that you get in real life. So I'm wondering if you could maybe give some insight into why you think we shouldn't take someone's behavior when they're under such personal attack into account. Because to me and a lot of other people, I think that seems fair when they're, serving one of the most important jobs for the rest of their lives.
Look, I think it's a fair point, and some of my conservative colleagues and I disagree on this. There are Republicans who supported Brett Kavanaugh until that moment, and then they felt that he didn't necessarily have a judicial temperament to serve on the court. I see it. I look at the totality of it, and I see most of the people who were making the argument about judicial temperament were also making the argument, they were also the same people coming in dressed up in Handmaid's Tales costumes, and they were the same people, right, who were against Justice Thomas and who were against Judge Bork. I mean, some of these same activists were involved in all three, and I could point out their names, but the point is that if you see the attack as part of a pattern, as I do, you realize that some people who are complaining about judicial temperament would have complained about anything. I mean, that was just their latest, that was just the most recent reason they gave why he shouldn't be on the bench. But really, it wasn't about temperament at all. It was about anybody. It was about XXX isn't qualified to be on the court. I mean, it wasn't even about Brett Kavanaugh. So that's one way that I look at it. Another way that I look at it is, just how people react when they're accused. So I can't separate it from the fact that I believe he was innocent. I can't separate it from the fact that I believe that claims about his temperament are just the last complaints in a long list of complaints that would have been made not only about him, but about anybody the president nominated. I can't separate that. But I know that some people can, and I think it's fair, right? Like I said, I know there are Republicans who supported Brett Kavanaugh up until that moment, and I respect that. I just see it in a different way.
I guess I'm asking the next question, and I think that was a great question. And I guess, first of all, your response to he shouldn't have acted that way is that how could he not have acted that way because he was accused of something? I mean, I mean, this is what the president says 30 times a day. And it's a very, very dangerous position, right? To say that once you are attacked, then you are allowed to say anything and do anything. And the idea that that he was only doing it because they had done it first or something is childish.
But let's define the it, like what it is we're talking about, right? I mean, what did he do? He raised his voice. He became red-faced. He became emotional. None of those things are, in and of themselves, disqualifying, in my view. I mean,
he attacked other people.
How did he do that?
Well, the Clintons. This was all the Clintons' revenge. I mean, I can't remember every single thing that happened, but just saw that.
Yeah,
clip.
people tend to focus on that a lot. I'm sorry?
Yeah, and Klobuchar. What's that? His Klobuchar, his response to Klobuchar.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I don't, that exchange we saw between Kavanaugh and Amy Klobuchar I didn't think it was very becoming. If I had been one of his handlers, I would not have advised him to handle it that way. But that doesn't mean I think it's disqualifying. So I'm agreeing with you on that particular point. The part about the Clintons, I think to some people it sort of sounds bizarre, like it's coming out of left field. What does this have to do with the Clintons? But from Brett Kavanaugh's perspective, he worked on the Whitewater investigation. He was probably, after Ken Starr, one of the people most responsible for President Clinton's impeachment. Believe me, the Clintons don't like him. Believe me, the Clintons didn't want him to get this job, and he knows that. So,
well, what is the implication of that statement? I mean, first of all, you don't need the Clintons to oppose his nomination, right?
No, of course
there are
not.
Lots of people who oppose his
I think
nomination. So the implication is that somehow or another this was a setup.
Well, I don't know, because I don't know what he was thinking, but I think
you do know what Dianne Feinstein was thinking.
No, I don't know what she was thinking, but I know what she did and didn't do.
You told us what she was thinking.
No, I said that I think that if she believed her, she would have acted a certain way. I think people who believe credible allegations and don't want somebody to be confirmed would act a certain way. I don't know what she was thinking, but I'm taking a guess based on her actions. But as for Kavanaugh and the Clintons, I think his point there, and look, I don't want to defend it too much because, like I said, I don't think he should have said it. But I think what he was getting at was two things. One is that, yes, the political team of the Clintons, not Bill and Hillary, but that political team did not like Brett Kavanaugh and was actively working against his nomination. That is true. People who worked on the Clinton campaign were actively working against his nomination. And people who voted for her and were upset with the results of the election were also working against his nomination. So it's not a completely crazy thing to say. It didn't come out right, and it certainly didn't help his cause to say it, but it's not a disqualifying thing to say.
You mentioned earlier that court packing would be an ineffective way to reduce the bias on the Supreme Court. Do you think there's anything that we could do in terms of nomination or like confirming justices that would make it less politically charged? Is there anything that we could do?
That would make nominations less politically charged or make the court less politically charged?
I think both. So there's less concern of like you said, like people holding on until the next president gets elected so that because they don't want Trump to nominate a justice.
Well, first of all, I think all of this is a little overblown in the sense that the court really shouldn't play this big a role in our lives to begin with. And people tend to focus, as was said earlier, on a few key issues: abortion, guns, campaign finance. And they think that everything the Supreme Court does has to do with those issues. It doesn't. The vast bulk of their work is pretty boring, actually, if you look at their docket. So I think we have to kind of settle down a little bit and not look at this as the sky is falling every time a justice retires and there's a new nomination. And personally, I think the criteria for confirmation should be ethics and qualifications. It shouldn't be personal attacks on someone's judicial philosophy, as it was with Robert Bork. And that's what it should be based on. And the truth is, if you're a senator, you don't have to have a reason to vote against a nominee. You can vote for them because you don't like the color of their shirt. You don't have to say that, right? So if you don't want to vote for a nominee, don't vote for the nominee. We don't have to turn it into a circus. That's all spectacle for the public. If you don't want to vote for a single Republican nominee, if you're a Democratic senator, or you're a Republican senator and you want to vote for a single Democratic nominee, don't.
So this is an evening where we've had some very clear and overt differences of opinion. And unlike the way we normally close these sessions, I would offer each of our guests an opportunity to make a brief closing statement if you'd like.
I will try to be very brief since you've heard a lot from me already today. I would just say this, that the goal of turning down the rhetoric is a great idea, but that the role of the court in our lifetimes has been to protect people that the majoritarian system can't protect on its own. And to the extent that the court continues to play that very important and powerful role, and other people are really disturbed about it because they prefer what the so-called majority wants, this level of rancor is going to continue until the country reaches a new consensus about its direction. And hopefully we'll be able to do that in a relatively short period of time.
Yeah, I would just reiterate that I think we all need to settle down about it. But if you do care about the courts, I would also say that elections have consequences, and presidential elections have consequences, and senatorial elections have consequences. And if it's something you care about, then you should vote on it, whichever way you feel about it. And once those decisions are made, and the Senate is controlled by one political party or another, and the White House is controlled by one political party or another, that we should respect that side's going to get their nominees. And I don't think we should be playing games with that. But if you care about it, then vote.
Thank you all for spending the evening with us, and thanks to our speakers. For those of you who will not be atoning next week, we will see you here.